Thank you. So I am actually just going to, I don't often do this, but in fact, the complexities of this particular area of conversation have been challenging me for quite some time. And therefore, I'm going to read the description of what was prepared for the overview today. And then the guests who are here to present will share a little bit about their own areas of practice in the areas in the order that I'm mentioning them. And I may kind of add a bit of editorializing as I read the description here. So again, I'm Eric Hartman at the Haverford College Center for Peace and Global Citizenship. This session, hosted by the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative, is called Language, Institutions, and Outcomes, Advancing Justice, Inclusion, and Sustainability Beyond Binaries. And it gets its momentum from these set of contrasts. In 2012, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang contributed an article that really rippled across many academic fields. It's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And the piece sets up and reinforces a pretty strong binary between what is and is not decolonizing activity. Yet Tuck and Yang have both embraced gray areas beyond binaries. Tuck, for example, writes about critical thirding in a piece called Suspending Damage, a letter to communities. And Yang, who wrote under the pen name La Paperson in A Third University is Possible, insists that categorical thinking is not the point. And he suggests that being ideology agnostic creates possibilities in every direction. Over the past year and beyond, I've been struck by the ways in which there are a lot of high-level conversations that insist on whether things are or are not things like colonial or decolonial. And when I say high level, I don't actually mean particularly sophisticated necessarily. I mean conversations that don't get down into the work of doing practice. And what I'm excited about today is that the people who are here speaking as expert panelists and guests are doing practice at these really important intersections and giving clear, applied, strong examples. So this webinar features a group of panelists who work at these intersections among decolonization, liberation, and existing systems. I suppose one more level or comment at that kind of high level conversation, I personally have begun to think about the notion of rights, that is human rights, democratic rights, the discourse around rights, to be inherently colonial and liberatory at the same time. When we use language of self-determination, when we use language of people having rights, we are appealing to a kind of tradition that is interwoven with colonial processes. And yet those same processes can adapt, can change, and can yield things like an Indigenous Tribal Peoples Convention that create new kinds of spaces. So perhaps we'll go toward that kind of conversation as we get into discussion. And as we do get into discussion, you all be very strongly encouraged to pop in questions in the chat, to pop in comments in the chat. This is a community. The collaborative is a community of people who support one another, who challenge one another, trying to do work that leads to more just, inclusive, sustainable communities at the end of the day. So each of the panelists is going to provide an overview of the work, and then we'll have that conversation. We're going to be exploring the ways these different systems can enable peaceful and decolonizing initiatives that alter our collective understanding, knowledge, and structures moving forward, hopefully toward greater liberation and pluralistic freedoms together. So I'll just briefly mention the panelists, all of whom I've had the opportunity to work with and I really admire. And then they'll be sharing their presentation in the order that I mentioned them. First, we'll hear from Felipe Lopez, who is a Zapotec writer, poet, and educator, joining us today from San Lucas Quiaviní, Oaxaca, Mexico. Ian McCallum, after Felipe, will be presenting from Lenape land in Ontario. He's an education officer in the Indigenous Education Office at the Ontario Ministry of Education and a member of the Munsee-Delaware First Nation. Jasmin Velez is Development and Communication Manager at the Kensington Corridor Trust, and will present third before we all share some conversation. So thank you each for being here. Very deeply appreciated. And Felipe, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And I'm going to do a brief presentation, but before that, I would like to say a few words in my language. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is, as Eric said, I'm Felipe Lopez, and what's called my clan is Barget. We have, in my community, we have 4 clans coming together, and we are a patrilineal language, so we can trace our heritage from memorial times, so we know where, our clans began. So thank you so much, everybody. So I'm gonna share, I'm gonna try to be brief and talk about. There we go. Okay, so let me just see if I can, oh boy. I'm always bad at this stuff. There we go. Can you see my presentation? All right. So I'm going to be talking briefly about decolonizing higher education with the project that I've been working for many years in collaboration with Indigenous communities. And the case study is the TEACHA project. So briefly, TEACHA is an international effort to document remote.
I'm sorry, Felipe, I want to check. It's like frozen on my screen. Can others? Because you were clicking slideshow, right? Are you slow?
Yes, I was.
Are others seeing the slideshow, or is it just kind of frozen?
Oh, it says my screen. Oh boy.
No, it's okay.
Okay, maybe I can. Okay, so I'm just going to talk then. So let me just stop sharing. There we go. So okay, so as I said, I'm doing a collaboration with TEACHA project, which is based at Harvard College, and it's online documents from colonial period which we use with indigenous communities, especially the Zapotecs in Oaxaca. It's an international collaboration. We work with students. So, Eric and we've been talking about what does it mean to decolonize, right? And I've been, as a Zapotec speaker and community, I've been kind of struggling with this idea. How do we actually, when we talk about decolonization, what does that mean? Many times we talk about decolonization in terms of the rhetoric in academia, but the reality is, how do we actually try to bring this decolonization into the classrooms on the one hand, and also in the communities, right? Because oftentimes, we think that we're doing decolonization educational, but yet we hardly take into consideration the people that we get the information from. For example, we talk about in terms of knowledge, right? In order to teach at the higher education, we always think about somebody who has a PhD, for example, but we never thought about where we draw the knowledge, which comes from the community. And in the case that I'm working with in my community is that, how the systems, educational system, how do they actually allow for decolonizing education higher? And I'm talking, actually, I work on both sides of the border. So one of the things that it's always really interesting to me, how I incorporate the higher institution in order to actually allow the community to have their own voices in the TEACHA project, because we work with colonial documents, and colonial documents are actually stored in colonial, I guess, entities such as archives, right? And also educational. In that sense, we are negated to access our own documents. But through Teacher, we've been able to use this platform in order to digitize them and bring them to the community and also connect them with contemporary languages. Because in these documents, we have access to our histories, to language, right? Because language is not a thing. Language, it's really who you are, at least as a Zapotec. Through language, I can connect with my people, I can connect my history, and also challenges what we teach at the higher level of education. So in that sense, it really, in this case, and also through CPGC that has supported the work that we do in order to bring the knowledge to the community. So I think that those are some of the work they've been doing, but specifically, I think like what are the challenges, right? So as I said, how do we recognize who is the expert, and also another thing for minoritized languages is the lack of pedagogical materials. How do we get it? And also who pays the collaborators, especially in the US, for non-US citizens, right? And also this short-term commitment to project, because many times we begin a little project and then many of these projects sort of disappear. So how do we do a continuation? How do you do follow-ups on these things? So all of that, I think that it's important to take into consideration. So, I think that we have to reframe which knowledge systems are valued in this case, like the communities, right? And also what that means, how do we make more diverse teaching materials available, especially for those created with the community? Many times, whatever we get from the community is not returned to the community. So, and also in education, it's really important to educate administration on campus office to realities of funding this kind of work to ensure that the system can actually support the financially, right? So just making sure that everybody, or we understand that PhDs, we're not the only people who have the knowledge to teach. So in the case of the teacher, we are making more diverse teaching materials, such as one of the courses that we have created for the community through a teacher program is the Kasait Nansan, which is based on the historical materials that we have on teacher. We have Kalichiu that now I'm actually teaching some kids at Harvard College based on this relation of that we have with the higher education. So I was going to show you some pictures of the kids who are working with the communities, but the Harvard College kids. But I guess, it's something that I think that it's important that if we talk about decolonizing higher education to the system, I think that we really need to think about it, not just in terms of the rhetoric that we use on campuses, but really bringing to the community the work that we do, especially working with the linguistics in my over 30 years. One of the things that I've seen is that many people, or even anthropologists, right, they come to the community, they sort of feel like that the extraction of knowledge without returning to the community. So I think that by returning to the community, it's a way to really, begin the process of sharing knowledge, information, and a process of decolonization that we talked about. And what that means is that using this system that exists, the colonial system, in order to bring the knowledge to community and learn from them as well. So I'm going to stop there. So I hope that, and I'll ask some questions that you might have in the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Felipe. We'll look forward to the conversation. Ian.
Manishi, can you hear me all right? Perfect. I appreciate the invite to come here today. So I'll follow Felipe's almost his template here, and I've got a lot of connections with the work that he's doing that might be of interest to the group. But I'll also do an introduction in the Munsee language, which from any indication in the chat, there's a lot of people that are on the Lenape territory, and of course, the Munsee language is one of the linguistic groups of the Lenape people. So here goes. Wala kishkwi kwamawan, nida shinzi wabanachka, ninonjai nalahi, shuk nuikian, Barrie, Ontario, nawalotman wunda kwa, ninalok nakpi, sheshko haloesek pambilak. So my name is Ian McCallum. I'm currently zooming in from north of Toronto, Ontario. So in the heartland of Ontario, central Ontario, a little town called Barrie, Ontario. My home community is Munsee-Delaware Nation, which is just southwest of London, Ontario, pretty close to Detroit. And I work for the Ministry of Education as my daytime job, but I do a lot of work for Munsee-Delaware in the capacity of both a language teacher, language researcher, but then also a history and culture researcher as well. So I thought I'd share a couple of interesting connections with the whole notion of decolonization or working within colonial structures as an Indigenous person. And as you can imagine, I've been an educator for well over 25 years now, both in a classroom and as working for the Ministry of Education. It's not a very popular job choice coming out of a First Nations community because, of course, of the long legacy of residential schools. The choice to be a teacher wasn't necessarily a positive one. However, I followed in the footsteps of a lot of people within my own family who were teachers, who chose that field. When I left the community to attend post-secondary education here in Ontario, I was told to learn their ways and then come back and share that. So there's that first clue as to the whole notion of, working within a colonial system, but also trying to work within the cracks of that system in order to bring back information so that the community could use it to their advantage. So I attended 3 universities here in Ontario. And of course, I worked for the Ministry of Education, which is, I guess, the penultimate of the colonial institutions here in Ontario. And what that overall arching theme of learn what you can to bring back to the community so that we can work within those cracks to make headway. Also works within the larger colonial institutions when I work as a in the language or culture field. And I better not get too far ahead of myself or I'll forget what I'm doing here. To share from the Ministry of Education perspective, when it comes to Indigenous language, there are 8 Indigenous languages that are available to be taught within Ontario schools. And they range from Haudenosaunee languages to Anishinaabe languages, Lenape languages, and most recently we've included the Inuktitut language, so the language of the people up north. And this sort of represents a decolonial process where for the very long time we had 7 languages within our portfolio that could be taught in province, and that lasted for 25 years. We found that a lot of students from the north were coming to Ottawa for jobs, but also their parents were coming to Ottawa, and there's a very vibrant Inuk community within Ottawa. And so we weren't doing the Inuit students any favors by not offering Inuktitut. And these students are coming from the north who have vast skill within the Inuktitut language. So within the last 5 years, we've developed a system where the Inuktitut elders in the Ottawa community are now able to certify their own teachers. I'm sure it's a similar process in the States where once you leave university, you have to maybe take an extra couple of years to become a teacher. You have to go to a teacher's college or a BA, BEd degree. And you're certified by a post-secondary institution in order to be a teacher. And what this model does was it acknowledges the actual community strength, the community ability to speak, and the ability for them to certify their own teachers. And the thinking is that, as an undergrad, I got 4 years to get my honors, and then I got 2 years of teacher's college. So I got 6 years. But what sort of value do you place on the education of someone who is a fluent Inuktitut speaker? How many years have they got in terms of the ability that they can that they can speak? I mean, you're looking at way more than just 6-year degree. So we're trying to find that value of, as a fluent speaker, you're able to now, what does that equate to, a 6-year degree as a language person? And you can't equate those things, but we're trying to find a different model by which to certify language teachers here in Ontario, simply because every school board here wants a language teacher. And a little background, Indigenous languages are usually taught in our schools anywhere from grade 4 to grade 12. And they model the French language, which is a mandatory subject area in all Ontario schools. Another decolonial process, excuse me, is that we're actually looking to now include kindergarten to grade 3. And the simple reason is that First Nation communities are saying, well, we have language immersion going on in our schools. What if a student from our community goes to an Ontario school and they're not able to access language, as a kindergarten student going into grade 1? So we as a province, and specifically some of the communities and the schools that I support, we're now trying to figure out how to implement a true K-12 model to support our students from communities coming into the public system, the Ontario system. And this complicates things, because actually within, some schools, you've got, 3 or 4 different languages being taught at different times, including, for my communities anyway, Anishinaabemowin and Mohawk are being taught. So it's quite a process. And I would honestly say that it comes back to that statement I said, that, go learn their system, work within the cracks, find people who can help you out. And so I work with a team of 6 education officers here in Ontario who come from various Indigenous communities. We talk about language. We talk about ways in which, policy can be changed or can be adapted to support the students in Ontario. Okay. If I switch gears to my after work job, I do work for Munsee-Delaware, so I don't work. I'm a volunteer for Munsee-Delaware Nation. I teach language, a language that has 1 fluent first language speaker remaining in the world, but a very healthy group of second language speakers and people who want to learn. So I always want to approach language in terms of the positives as opposed to, language death. Currently, I was looking for a word, and the word was wampum belt. I'm not a big, flashy item kind of person. I really like to dig into the research and figure out language, but the word for wampum belt didn't exist in our dictionary. And so I found it, but I found it on a card from an anthropologist who came and purchased items from Munsee-Delaware in 1907. And the word for Okwessoon is what he wrote down when he interviewed someone from our community as a translation for wampum belt. So with the advent of NAGPRA in the States, a very important museum gallery in New York was closed. So the Eastern Woodlands exhibit in the American Museum of Natural History was closed, and that included many items from Munsee-Delaware Nation, including a wampum belt. That was very important to us. Because we're not an American First Nation anymore, I guess. I don't know if I want to say that. We're not a First Nation that no longer lives in the New York area due to a lot of extenuating circumstances over the 350 years. We've have the luxury of actually being able to communicate with the museum, whereas it tends to be a little bit more difficult for those that are still on what's now the United States. So we're able to work with, again, people who are working within the craft, people who are First Nations, Indigenous people who are able to support us in terms of getting that wampum belt to actually come out of the museum. This is the very first item that we've ever had come out of a museum as a community. We've never had, even items here in Canada have not come out of the museum for our community to actually take a look at. So if you look at, the Smithsonian Museum, which arguably is another old colonial structure, we're able to, work our magic within the cracks to find people who can help us and support us to bring that wampum belt to Princeton. So it's coming to Princeton on October the 30th. We have a busload. I don't know if there's anybody left in the community. There might be all 150 people who live there are actually coming down to visit the belt, including the family of the person who gave up the belt. And to add on to this, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia was very helpful in terms of finding those notes that went along with the item. So Frank Speck came to Munsee. He interviewed a couple of people, but he also recorded their names in the language. So now we've actually are able to now bring together all these different webs of pieces of information that go with this wampum belt to make it more of a less than an object, or it's not an object any longer, but now it's got a really social impact for the community. And I'd argue that comes through finding the key people in these big colonial structures to, like, it sort of eats away. I always say it eats away. We like to eat away at the system, right? We want to make sure that when I leave this world, that my kids can now push those cracks even further apart. And maybe what I'll do is I'll stop there and I'll answer questions at the end. Anishik, Moen, thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're moving into Philadelphia again with Jasmin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite. I'm really excited to be here. I'm here to chat today a little bit about what's called the Kensington Corridor Trust, or a neighborhood trust model. And I'll explain what that is. I actually have a presentation that I can pull up if it works, and if not, I'm happy to just to chat informally, or well, formally, but without the visual guide. So the Kensington, can you see my screen before I even go into this? Okay, beautiful. The Kensington Corridor Trust really grew out of what was initially just a theory that a law professor from Cornell University, his name is Joseph Marculi, he wrote an article for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, really questioning what would it look like for community members to actually own the real estate in their neighborhoods. How do you make that happen? And in truth, he wrote it in frustrations, just out of seeing how economic or community development programs were not necessarily in the hands of community members. They weren't really the ones making community decisions, but rather it was other institutions. And so this article that he wrote was founded by, or a few of our founders actually came across this article, who were sitting around trying to ideate, how do we bring businesses into the community in Kensington? How do we give power back to community members to make decisions around the future of what their neighborhood is going to look like? What sorts of businesses they want to see in the neighborhood, what sorts of just physical improvements they want to see, and so forth. And really the issue that they were trying to tackle was a massive amount of vacancy on Kensington Avenue. For those of you who may not be familiar with what's happening in Kensington and Philadelphia, currently it's a predominantly Latino, Black and Brown neighborhood. About 60% of the residents in Kensington identify as Latino, Latina, Hispanic. Most folks are living at 50% below or at the poverty line, meaning that they're making about $26,000 a year. And then just decades of disinvestment from city agencies. And truthfully, an additional barrier, or I should say layer to this, has been an opioid crisis that has really impacted the community at whole. So the founders of the KCT, or the founding partners, I should call them, we're sitting around trying to think about how do we do this work differently in a way that does include the community. Currently the status quo, as we see fit, it just isn't really being as inclusive as it needs to be. So they came across this article and decided, like, this is exactly how we need to do it. We want to work on creating this idea of what's called a neighborhood trust, meaning essentially it's a kind of a combination of a nonprofit arm and what's called a perpetual purpose trust. It had never been done before. We're the first in the US to do it. specifically around commercial real estate, and focused on both commercial and affordable housing. And so, again, as I said, it had never been done before. And I think it really ties into this question of how are we working within the colonial system and how are we challenging sort of the capitalist system at hand in a way that it can benefit the collective. Um, and so the nonprofit 501c3 with the Perpetual Purpose Trust was born or created and tethered together legally through the IRS. And, it's very, very viable at this point. We're 5 years in. But again, it was very new, and a lot of the early days were really focused on how do we make this happen? How is this a thing that can, how can we create something that had never been done before, in a way, again, that is going to be inclusive of community members. So those first kind of, I would say about 3 years, we were really focused on thinking about technical assistance, getting lawyers involved, a lot of learning, a lot of conversation. And then really part of that conversation that took place in the early days was the folks who were at the table at the inception of the KCT. And they recognize many of us are coming from institutions who are actually, already executive directors or leading a lot of nonprofits, but there aren't many community voices here in the room. And so how can we advocate and fight for community representation when they don't have a seat at this table? And so many of them actually ceded their board seats, and board control started to transition into the neighborhood. And so anyone who lived in the community or has a small business became eligible to serve on the board. And so that control sort of transitioned in around 2021. From there, now we're functioning as a nonprofit with that Perpetual Purpose Trust arm, and we're very much in the sort of growth state. We're really focused on acquisition right now and thinking about we went through a whole entire community engagement process around defining what purpose meant for us for the KCT, who would have seats at the table, how long they could serve at the table, and how often they needed to transition out, so that there was constant communication from other community members and a sort of a flow of different faces over time. So I'll kind of shift into this. Right now, the KCT, our board of directors and our trust stewardship committee is completely governed by community members, residents, or small businesses. There are certain archetypes. I won't get too into them, but you have to either live in this neighborhood or have a small business here to actually have a seat on any of our boards. And for the purpose, there's actual times that are coming into play there. So if you've lived in the neighborhood for at least 5 years, you're eligible to serve, but preference is going to folks who've been here for 10 years. And really, like, I didn't really mention this in the beginning, but the purpose of this is to not only attract businesses onto Kensington Avenue. We recognize that that's really an important element for folks in this community. People really, want to see the commercial corridor thriving. It's very much the only place where many people are able to go to shop for school supplies, to get their groceries, to get, to go out to dinner. It's really about how do we collectively own this work and then continue to define these spaces, recognizing how much displacement and gentrification is impacting this community. We're seeing astronomical rates astronomical rates for rental units going up from maybe what was once $500, $600, and they're tripling. And as I mentioned earlier, these are folks who are making potentially $26,000 a year, if that. And so the challenge was really, how do we address that in a way that, we can at least protect or create pockets of affordability in this community while also encouraging a thriving commercial corridor space. So these are the folks at the table right now. They serve in 2-year seats, and every 2 years we have an open election where folks can nominate themselves or others to serve on the board. I don't want to like overdo this. I do this deck quite often. It's a little long, so I'm trying to like speed it up for y'all. But our goals and our priorities here, our points of impact, are really thinking about power, justice, and ownership. Really, our focus is, again, getting community voices at the table, making sure that anything we do is approved and a need or a want from community members, including what businesses we're bringing to the table. So we will never just sign leases to folks. We go through a really in-depth community engagement process where folks have the opportunity to request certain types of businesses, where folks can say, we don't want to see this business on the avenue. And really are part of that decision-making power. Justice, again, we're really thinking about how do we just continue to advocate for better resources in this community. I've mentioned that the city of Philadelphia was disinvested in Kensington for decades, and it's really evident when you see the lack of spaces that are that are taken care of, the lack of businesses on the avenue. And it's interesting to see now, like as the neighborhood continues to gentrify, how suddenly there's interest from the city officials in the city of Philadelphia to start bringing in resources where a lot of this work had already been happening because of community members. So a lot of advocating around policies, but just policies, and thinking about what affordability means and land conservation and land preservation, and how do we ensure that it continues to stay in the hands of community members, which ties into our ownership piece. When I talk about ownership, I'm always very clear with community members and other folks who may not be familiar with this model. There's no direct benefit. It's not like profits from the rental units ever get put into, it doesn't pay my salary. It doesn't go into one person specifically. It's really about a collective sort of pot where folks can kind of think about, okay, we have made an extra $5,000 this year in profits. How do we reinvest that back into the neighborhood? So for the collective benefit, not solely an individual benefit. But really that ownership piece is important, because when you own that land or you have control over that land in these circumstances, you now have the ability to really shape the future of what the neighborhood is going to continue to look like. And as I mentioned, as we continue to see this displacement and gentrification, these are spaces that we're preserving affordability in for the long run. And we hope that it can help us maintain sort of our community in place, versus seeing them be displaced as has been happening over the past 10 years or so. Just to paint a bigger picture, this is what sort of the avenue that we focus on across Kensington Ave. There's about 627 assets, meaning that these are either vacant or dilapidated spaces, or vacant land that has an opportunity to be greened, and converted into garden spaces. Right now, our target area is between Allegheny and Tioga Avenue. There's about 192 assets between those two block radiuses. And we're really intentional about focusing on smaller blocks, just because we want to really create that visual impact for folks in the neighborhood. We want there to be a sense of community building between business owners, and it would be really difficult if someone was over here on Lehigh and then there's two businesses here on Tioga and one here over there in Allegheny. So it's really about how do we collectively work in one space at a time and then start to grow outwards on the avenue. To date, I'm really excited to say that we're at 23 assets total that are collectively owned by folks in the neighborhood. 11 of which are land conservation space. It's our community garden. It's one of the largest community planted native pollinator gardens across the city. And really an area for activation, and a lot of educational programs happen here with community members. It's really a convening space for folks to spend time in green space, which is really lacking in this community, but also to ask questions about what KCT does. How do we think about expanding this work so that it continues to benefit folks in the community? What does it mean to actually collectively own land, right? There's a lot of real estate that sort of comes into play here, and a lot of jargon that is new to folks. And a lot of the work that we have done is around educating folks around, this is what it means. This is what equity means. This is how it will benefit the community in the long run. This is what a land trust does. This is what a perpetual purpose trust does. And so it's constantly space for learning and just sharing, and also community building, which I think is a really important component of this work. And thinking about creating beautiful spaces as well that folks can utilize to benefit their needs. All those kiddos that you see in the photo, I love to point this out, and I'm going to wrap this up, but all those photos that you see, all those kids are actually painted on the mural behind them. And so it's been really cool to see this work sort of grow. And these kiddos here, this was a few years ago, are even taller now than they were in this photo a few years ago. So really great to see this work continue to grow. Again, I mentioned it earlier, mixed commercial residential spaces, really acquiring around that vacant or that dilapidated spaces, and focused on just stabilizing between a small region for now. But the work will eventually grow, or so we hope. We're not acquiring more than 5 properties a year. If we can, we will, but the goal is really to grow with an intentional rate along with community members, not just sort of purchase as much land as we can, because then it's not a viable model. We want to make sure that whatever we're purchasing can be maintained and can be stewarded and can live in the trust without it being a burden on community members either. So So yeah, property by property, our earlier goal is to work towards neighborhood control and community and collective ownership in the long run. And that's what we're doing. So I'm gonna stop sharing this real quickly. Um, and I just want to add before I end also is that I think the other element to this is really that our work is rooted in the solidarity economy framework and really thinking about people people and the planet over profits. That's always number one. And sometimes that means that we have to work at a slower pace than maybe other organizations are working at. But we're okay with that, right? We want to grow with community members. We are okay to have the same conversation 50, 30, 15 to 30 times over because eventually it's going to stick, and it's been really cool to see the work grow. One sort of anecdote I'll make too is that we have two youth seats right now. It's folks who are age 16 to 21 who serve on our board, and these young people have just like they're whizzes. They're so smart, and they ask some of the most intelligent questions I have ever heard. And they like things about real estate that I don't think I even as an adult have ever thought about. So it's really cool to see their growth, happening over the last few years. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the next 5 years continues to grow. We just celebrated 5 years, so yeah, that's what KCT does. Really rooted in that collective ownership piece and community wealth building over time.
Thank you so much. Many thanks to each of you. I'm gonna do a little bit of connecting some dots here and ask a couple of questions. But I really want to remind everyone, drop your questions or comments or thoughts in the chat because we're eager to generate from what's in the community, very much so. So again, thank you for being here, and you're most welcome to drop thoughts in. So I appreciate the returning to the metaphor, the sort of the system and the cracks, and I want to play with that for a little while, Ian. I think it's across a lot of the work. One amazing thing about operating the cracks or being the cracks or seeing growth in the cracks is sometimes you do see, well, you've seen an oak tree split a sidewalk. You've seen a tree overtake an old foundation. You've seen wisteria. If anyone lives near wisteria, you see it grow like 6 feet in a season. So it's not always, it doesn't always stay in the cracks. And in fact, whole systems develop. And one of the things that La Paperson tries to write us toward or get us to think about a third university as possible is when we operate as these kind of innovators in the cracks, we are leveraging parts of the system to create new systems, and we're leveraging new technologies to create new possibilities. And so, Jasmin, thank you for the Kensington Corridor Trust overview. I am so fascinated that you took like the primary, what many people might call the primary colonial technology, that's property, right? And the notion of ownership. And you're innovating it in a way that is community oriented and in a way liberatory. And that is amazing. And the kind of like juxtaposition I hope we can like dive into. Also Kensington, I mean, for folks who aren't, you mentioned it's an incredibly diverse community now. It's a globally diverse community. It has been, it's just so many peoples have moved through and it's such a dynamic place of globality over time, which I think is interesting to think about across identity and people movement. But I wanted to stay on that. We're part of the system. We're in the cracks, but we're also leveraging components of systems. This is the Paperson quote. He's saying as an individual in that text that Mike just shared. My position is impossible, a colonialist byproduct of empire with decolonizing desires. I am, and maybe you are too, a produced colonialist. He's trying to get us to wiggle in that space. Felipe, I actually wanted to ask you a question that goes back to the beginning with your work. If you could share the language activism that started from within the community, like just a little bit about how things got started with the Teacher Project, is my question. And because I think it's an amazing example of a community's own desires leading to a kind of leveraging. but just share it however you would. The thing I've never asked before, and I'm curious about, when you were starting that, did was it within the language of decolonizing, or was it, or no? I don't know if that language is present, but I'm just interested in folks hearing how that emerged and how it led you to search for linguists, right? In a sense. So that's a, and then I have other questions, but I'll stop there.
I don't know how much time we have, Eric, but I tried to synthesize that. And just like Ian, I think that I don't know how many people know, but in Mexico, there has been, just like in the US and probably in Canada, boarding schools. So I'm one of the last products of boarding schools in Mexico. And so when I was in boarding school, I was sort of assimilated into the mestizo society in Mexico and denying everything that I was as a Zapotec, as an indigenous person. And when I live in Mexico and I moved to the States and then I started working, I got my BA at UCLA, and then that's when actually kind of triggered in me. And looking around my community, I have more people in the US than actually in Oaxaca, through the diaspora. And I understood the loss of the language, and I took advantage that I was at UCLA and trying to think about, recognizing the importance of language and identity. For me, going 180 degrees turn and questioning who I am, why wasn't my language value as much as Zapotec, or as Spanish or English in the States, and seeing how kids were trying to be modern, trying to learn Spanish and English and forgetting Zapotec. So I sort of took the first step in trying to record my language. And through this at UCLA, to this institution, that actually one of the first things that I recognized, the way in which I could use, if I, use that word, how could I use this institution in order to actually maintain my language? But that required a lot of work from our part in trying to get fundings and trying to get, which was under this colonial system, right? In order to provide for the community. So that's a way of I think that without even thinking about this decolonization process that became later, and working with archives, which is the irony, right? Like, how do we, through the colonial system, they appropriated a lot of the documents that we have that also started at UCLA. So combining the linguistic aspect and the documents that it's been, on the one hand, stored at archives, and then with UCLA trying to help me bring the language to the community, if that makes sense. So it's been a process. On the one hand, this institution trying to assimilate me, but on the other, allowing me to work with my community to bring knowledge, to our own knowledge, our own documents to the community, where we have, I guess, the archives has allowed us to access again to the history that we have lost, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is really the paradox between how we view institution and also how it serves, but also we as Indigenous people, we can take advantage of what opportunity it gives for us to regain our language and knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I'm curious how any of you might answer this, but maybe I'll direct toward Ian and Jasmin at first. Ian, it was amazing to hear about your own work with Munsee-Delaware community, and then also this 8 indigenous languages that are being shared as part of the Ontario School Curricular Initiative. And I was curious how you might, the question is what are the pluralistic benefits, the broad public community benefits of linguistic activism, which might often start in a singular community that's anti-colonial in a sense, and perhaps when several different languages are celebrated, it's a different kind of frame. That's for Ian. I think it connects to all these conversations, but you can see where it goes.
Sure. So there's two situations. One, in local schools here where I live, all kids have the opportunity to learn Ojibwe language. And so what you have is you actually have, like, let's say it's an elementary school of about 400 students, K-8. You have literally a quarter of those students taking Ojibwe. They may not be from our area First Nation communities at all. They might be just interested students who want to take Ojibwe. My son took Ojibwe as his grade 9 credit, but there's quite a number of students in there who are not Indigenous who are taking Ojibwe. So I think you've got a real opportunity here where it's not just the language program for students from community, but it's actually for the whole school, much like French is. So there's no limitations in terms of who can take this. So now you've got people coming out of an elementary school at the end of grade 8 going into grade 9 who now have touched both the French language and the Ojibwe language. And then they have the ability in grade 9 to use Ojibwe instead of French if they choose. But I think that really develops the mind, and it really allows people to come away with having spoken an Indigenous language before they go into grade 9. And I think that does a lot for you know, community cohesiveness, community First Nations communities working with urban folk who are not Indigenous. I think it really does sort of support that. Where was I going with this? With the community, I was thinking of community. Oh, community resource. So for Munsee, we're a very small community that's actually within a much larger Ojibwe speaking community. So they speak Chippewa, but it's an Ojibwe dialect. And then across the river is Oneida Nation of the Thames, and they speak Oneida, which is a Haudenosaunee language. So in our daycare, we actually have, at any one time, we have 5 languages going on. So it's like a mini Switzerland, because we're all interrelated. Like I have Oneida cousins, and I have Chippewa cousins. So when kids come to our daycare, they're able to speak both Munsee, Chippewa, and Oneida. And if you throw in the 2 official languages of Canada, English and French, you can have 5 languages going on in just our daycare. So you actually have our youngest are able to touch more languages than we can as adults in our community, because they're in that environment every day. And that includes going out onto the land, learning the medicines in the language, saying the Thanksgiving address every morning in Oneida, but also doing the prayer in Munsee and the Ojibwe language. So I think those are two situations where it's a benefit for all, as opposed to just a benefit for my community or for a benefit for one of the communities I work for. Is that, a lot of people are able to get in on this. And I think that breaks down that colonial mindset, but also that the undertones of racism as well. I think that it goes a long way with, are people able to, understand where others are coming from because they're learning their language. So I hope that answers that.
Thank you so much. It answers in a really rich way, beautiful way. Jasmin, I don't know if you had a thought already on the sort of pluralistic benefit of KCT. One thing that has occurred to me as we've been talking is this collective ownership and the way that it invokes a lot of organizing and co-thinking. I wonder if you see ways that it's translating to kind of collective neighborhood political participation and or political power, or other kinds of benefits beyond the kind of ownership mission.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, first I'll say too, like we do have an advocacy sort of arm in at KCT. And part of that is really led by community members, and it's really focused on the things that they want to see change. And so when we talk about affordability as one example, right? What does affordability mean to someone in Kensington? versus maybe someone in Center City versus someone in even in Haverford, right? And that conversation, it can go a variety of different ways. And so right now we're part of a larger coalition that's thinking about just getting policy around defining affordability, because there's really nothing across the city of Philadelphia that defines that. And quite frankly, we're actually our income levels are actually quite skewed because they're taking into account sort of richer counties like Montgomery County, Manayunk areas. And so what the average gross income is in Philadelphia is actually quite lower than what the city is reporting, right? Anyway, this is really feeding a lot of the work that we're trying to do now around advocacy, around defining affordability. We've been, along with a variety of different wonderful organizations, have been doing work around land conservation and protecting garden spaces, who are highly at risk due to the massive amount of development that's happening across the city. It's not just in Kensington. We're seeing a lot of garden spaces lose their parcels solely because someone pops up out of nowhere and says, "I bought this off a sheriff's sale yesterday. It's mine now. You need to go." And so, this really drives the policy spaces that we're in. It's not like KCT on the nonprofit arm is really making decisions. I'm going to do policy around this tomorrow. It's very much what is happening on the ground, what conversations we're having with community members, and what spaces we feel we can help advocate with them, along with them. And part of that is also education around how do you go to city council, how do you go to the Capitol in Harrisburg, and how do you have these conversations with city officials city and state officials who do have the power to change policies and that to benefit your community. And so it's why we actually were very intentional about hiring a community organizer versus someone who just does community engagement. Community engagement I mean, it feeds into organizing work and it's really important. And you're not really having those conversations on the ground otherwise, but it was a very intentional choice by Adriana, who's our executive director, in the early days of when KCT was being sort of formed. So yeah, I would say like the policy space is really, again, just defined by community members. Right now, we're also advocating around illegal dumping and trash because it's a consistent issue in the community, and it's not a space that we were overly familiar with, but it continues to come up in conversations every single day. So if it comes up in a conversation and we have at least some wiggle room here to like go to City Hall or go to the Capitol and advocate along with community members, why would we not do that? If we're saying these are spaces that are collectively owned by everyone here, and these are the folks who are telling us this is a need and this is impacting our community as a whole, it wouldn't make sense for us not to go into those spaces and advocate along with them. So yeah, we have a variety of different sort of policy spaces that we work within, but again, really led by community members in that process. And I don't think we would want it any other way. And part of that is education around how to mobilize and how to get your neighbors involved in the process. And it's been cool to see. Like I've gone to city council with community members and they have plenty to say. They know what they can advocate for themselves. But I think it helps when you have somebody who does know how to sort of work within the system a little bit and who knows how to navigate those spaces. There's a level of comfort and trust that comes along with that. And over time, people just build and develop that skill where they can just go ahead and go to city council by themselves and they don't need KCT to go there. But yeah, it's different sort of parts, but I think really all ties into that larger approach in our policy advocacy work.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to try to ask a big broad question back up to the clouds here, and see if Felipe, Ian, Jasmin, or anyone want to weigh in and reinvite and remind. I mean, several folks here are very familiar friends, and then other folks are new, but it's an open space for sure. I've been thinking about these different initiatives and wondering about whether we're talking about the ongoing need for a much healthier and much more real pluralism, right? Which would be something that is in many ways familiar and uses some of the structures that we have inherited from colonial regimes, but reimagines them. And that I'm thinking about that from the space of, it feels like making space and holding power are a common theme, Felipe, when I hear you saying I'm noticing Zapotec in the community where I am in Los Angeles and the need to preserve. That's like, where's the space for that? Where's the opportunity to do that? How's power leveraged for that? When I hear you talk about that multilingual daycare scene, Ian, I'm like, wow, I'm jealous. Wish my kids were in that daycare. But it sounds like there's space there where there's many different traditions being honored, recognized, welcomed. And then in some way, Jasmin, when you were talking about that intersection, this kind of economic co-ownership and the way it leads to different kinds of advocacy, it sounds like very much a set of community members saying, we need our space to live, to be ours, to be owned, to have autonomy. And that requires some economic reimagination, right? And particularly in this case, an intervention against predatory lending in the neighborhood. But all of that was, these initiatives are all happening in ways inside of a kind of pluralistic rights tradition. And maybe that is interesting and important in a process to maintain. Thinking about it that way is a bit different from a kind of yes, no, colonial, anti-colonial. And I wanted to set that on the table and see what it sounded like, or what thoughts or critiques of that framing, might present for you. This is where does that make sense?
I can weigh in, I think, and I hope I understand correctly. How best to do this? So as the Ministry of Education, we have responsibility over 72 school boards, and we're nominally responsible for curriculum and other things on a provincial level. But a lot of things can happen locally. One of the pieces that has happened within the last 5 years is that there's actually what we would call a First Nations specific Ministry of Education. So it supports 23 First Nations in Ontario, from Thunder Bay all the way down to Sarnia, which is just across from Detroit. So a vast area. And what they've done, I guess, is their whole existence is to try and not reimagine themselves as a Ministry of Education, but to support First Nation communities in working with the Ministry of Education. So they've come at it from a First Nations lens, in terms of providing key services for their students, such as special education needs, their own localized curriculum that represents their communities and their languages. They advocate in terms of anti-racism that could be going on in the schools, and they operate on a sort of a K-12 model as well. So it's where the acknowledgement of that the colonial structure it's not going to disappear anytime soon, but how can communities advocate in a way, not against, but with this colonial system to best support, in this case, 23 First Nation communities. So I don't know if I'm missing the mark, but I'm hoping maybe not. Lots of distractions here. It's the end of day of school.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. So in some way, you're recognizing the policy of the state at the moment is to expand space, and so this is where we are and where opportunities are emerging. And actually, I really appreciate we have not emphasized the three country North American discursive opportunity here, but we do have incredibly different policy structures as it relates to any, I mean, indigenous languages or communal land ownership, but drawing attention to ways in which different kinds of experiments and pluralism lead to different kinds of opportunities is an interesting opportunity we'd have here as well. Felipe, I saw the fires burning. Yeah.
I mean, just thinking what you're asking in terms of, how do we reimagine systems of changes and decolonization, whether these are two separate things. And I do struggle with that because I am within the system, colonial systems, that we live every day. But at the same time, how do we actually begin to open more into incorporating communities' voices? And I think there's so much intertwined that when we talk about decolonization, we really need to think about what do we mean, right? For example, one of the things that we're doing through Teacher is the digital repatriation of documents within this colonial system. But we use that technology in order to actually go to the community and who cannot have access to their documents in, I don't know, in Spain, or US or Mexico City. So in a sense, I don't think that, I guess what I'm trying to struggle with is that really a process of decolonization, or we need to find new ways of describing this interrelationship between colonial systems and access to local knowledges, especially when we talk about indigenous communities, right? One thing comes to my mind is there is I think it's an African writer who writes about decolonizing the mind, right? If we really need to decolonize, what does that mean? And ironically, one of the conclusions of this person says, like, we always talk about decolonization, decolonizing the mind, but we need to use the colonial language in order to reach the broader public. So that's the irony of it, right? So that's what I'm, when I said, like, we need to rethink about this, because decolonization perhaps is, it's a challenging concept to think about the colonial systems and the colonized people. They're all intertwined nowadays, and we need to be able to not separate them, but think about the juncture where we can both benefit. I think, I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but I do think that, seeing this bipolar, whether colonized and colonizers, they are not so much distant, but rather find a way of how do we both benefit. And I know that many people might not agree with me, but it is the reality, right, that in which we live in, to talk about decolonizing. But what does that really mean? So I guess I'm answering a question with a question. So something to think about.
Yeah, and you've given us a lot too. I mean, I really appreciate the push on framing differently. We involved with the collaborative at Center for Peace and Global Citizenship a couple of years ago started using interdependence as a framing more frequently. And your comments made me think of that, also related to, I know one thing in the whenever harm is done somewhere, of course, in the US, we have an issue around mass incarceration. A lot of human rights advocates recognize. And an intervention there is restorative justice. And one of the assumptions of restorative justice is everyone affected is always involved. And it's actually often striking to me how a lot of my colleagues and peers who are deeply committed to restorative justice when we get into other conversational spaces, might be more likely to think in binary. But you were just prompting us to think a little bit about not engaging that, but thinking like, where are we? How are we interrelated? And what do we do with that? So thank you for all of that. Jasmin.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a shot. I don't know. I think a few things like we're consistently having the conversation about how can we function within a capitalistic system that has continuously oppressed people and continuously just creates sort of spaces where it kind of traps people in cycles of poverty and cycles of violence and how can we challenge that in a way that is really rooted in what I mentioned earlier, which is that the idea of solidarity economy, ecosystem and framework, um, and recognize like we know that the capitalist system as it exists now was built on on stolen land and stolen lives, and how do we change the conversation and change the framework so that we can start building things that have more community control and really restore that sort of relationship around like again people and planet over profits over these sort of larger institutions. And I think for KCT the goal is to see this work replicated or duplicated in other neighborhoods if they want to do that, right? And so um where a lot of our work is around education, around how to create these trusts, how to create these models. And a lot of them are happening with conversations with other communities maybe within Philly and sometimes out of the state. But it would be really cool to see folks sort of take on this model and make it their own and figure it out. But I don't know if I'm answering the question quite frankly, but really I think the idea of around solidarities economies and 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 how we sort of created this land trust or this neighborhood trust model. This is not new. This has been happening for across communities, across states. It's really just for us, like how do we start that conversation around what else can be, right? How else can society be? How else can communities navigate these systems and really have that power back in their hands to make decisions around what's happening in their spaces. With land in particular, and I can only speak in the context of Philly because that's what I'm most familiar with, right? I think it's really interesting because we're talking about a community who does not have not many folks have access to generational wealth building, who may not have been able to purchase these properties outright. And so we had to think about an alternative way that um, that we could get the funding to then ensure that this collective ownership piece could happen. But outside of that, like how else can you buy a $200,000 property on the avenue when you're struggling to make ends meet? And so like it's how do we have these conversations about how else the world could be or how else how else what other models or things can exist within this system, just recognizing that right now it is sort of this larger I guess system with a capital S, right? It's this massive thing that can be really daunting for folks to have conversations around, can be really daunting to advocate for yourself when again you're just trying to live day to day. So again, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm doing the best here, but yeah, I think it's really about sparking that conversation and engaging folks around alternative models, alternative ecosystems of how people can live and how people can focus on building one another up versus just idealizing sort of systems that continue to keep people in that perpetuated sort of violence that they're experiencing every day. Um, so yeah, really community power, community decision making, and people and planet always. That's sort of the conversations that we really try to encourage with folks. And yeah, sometimes that means understanding how the system works so that then you can better stand up for it whenever against it rather whenever you do need something for your community. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's sort of how my brain was going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're highlighting an amazing example of solidarity work inside of existing structures that is doing what Paperson said was possible in universities, but doing it in the space of land and municipalities. And so you're leveraging new possibilities in a nonviolent way inside of existing systems. Really thoughtful. Thank you. It is 5. I want to honor that because of the cultural conditioning that I've grown up with, but and the kind of worlds we live in. But I so appreciate each of you and everyone who chimed in today, and I look forward to continuing the collaborations and conversations across these spaces where we work. So thank you for enlightening us with your comments, and thanks to everyone who stuck with us as well.
Thank you for the invite. Gracias por la invitación. It's been an honor to chat with all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.